Welcome back to this Sunday edition of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, broadcasting to you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Tell you what we're up to yesterday and some interesting news on the Quebec front when we come back.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change, but we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station, subscribe if you haven't. We really appreciate your subscription, and resubscribe if YouTube has done that to you. I know possibly you've unsubscribed because I've said something offensive, but I have to say it. This is not the show where I'm going to spew propaganda for any political side. You know, I'm a small c conservative, small l libertarian, but I am prepared to criticize anything, anytime. And so I'm not here to bring a comfort zone. I'm here to invoke a sense of thinking and a sense of what should we do next? How is this country going to survive under the current circumstances? Anyway, tell you a story. I was out yesterday in Ottawa and doing some interviews with my good friend Jason Levine, who will be joining us later, about a quarter after the hour. And so we filmed about an hour-long interview, which he will be piecing together and putting on the air, I guess, within the next couple of weeks or so. He's been doing interviews across the country, but we'll talk about that later. But after the interview, and of course, my good friend Lisa Robinson was also being interviewed just after I talked to her yesterday on this show. And we all went out to dinner afterwards. And incredible as it is, we're sitting in the Colonnade restaurant. You know, I don't mind giving a pitch to the Colonnade, the downtown Colonnade. I used to go to the Colonnade quite frequently when I worked for a member of parliament named Art Hanger, who lived just a block or so away. And we used to go there for pizza, and it was a wonderful memory. And so I always go back to the Colonnade and expecting everybody, of course, to look the same as they did those 20 years ago, but that's not to be. So we're sitting there just about to order. And a guy walks up to the table and says, "Are you David Krayden?" And I said, "Yes." He says, I watch your show every day. And I really needed a boost like that yesterday. But this is Mike. No last name, please. And this is we're getting a selfie together at the Colonnade restaurant. And it was a real pleasure. Thank you, Mike, for coming up and saying hi. And by the way, if you see me out and about, I'm always happy to stop and chat. But we've got some interesting news for you here. Oh, I'm going to get to that in a minute. The real news plug today is what's going on with Quebec. Right after King Charles waves goodbye, Quebec lawmakers vote unanimously to end ties with the British monarchy. This is on May 28th, right after King Charles III read the speech from the throne. Now, this was reported in actually a lot of publications, the Montreal Gazette, Globe and Mail, CTV News. However, nobody thought to ask, what does this mean if Quebec has unilaterally disavowed the Canadian head of state? Does this mean Quebec has basically, essentially, legally separated from Canada? This was a vote in the Quebec legislature. Now, I was completely unaware. I missed the story entirely. It has not been discussed since this broke on May 28th. There's been very little discussion about it. But I got a call yesterday from my good friend Jeff Rath, a constitutional lawyer from Alberta, who asked me, so what do you think this means? What do you think it means if Quebec says we don't recognize the Canadian head of state? Is that de facto or, in effect, separation? Does that mean they no longer are part of the Canadian politic or polity? I would argue that that's exactly what it means. And what about all of those Quebec MPs who are part of the Carney government? Are they legitimate? Are these legitimate MPs if their province doesn't recognize the Canadian head of state? I think this is a question that needs to be answered. But here's
Madame la Présidente, je sollicite le consentement des membres de cette Assemblée afin de présenter, conjointement avec la chef du deuxième groupe d'opposition, la motion suivante, que l'Assemblée nationale affirme sans équivoque qu'elle est la seule dépositaire de l'expression démocratique du peuple québécois, qu'elle souligne qu'une très forte majorité de Québécois et de Québécoises n'éprouvent aucun attachement envers la monarchie britannique, que l'Assemblée nationale convienne d'abolir le lien entre l'État du Québec et la monarchie britannique. Bravo.
Merci, Monsieur le chef. Y a-t-il le consentement pour débattre de cette motion, Monsieur le leader adjoint du gouvernement?
Il y a consentement sans débat, Madame la Présidente.
Cette motion est-elle adoptée? Monsieur le député de Matane-Matapédia?
Pourquoi pas voter, Madame la Présidente?
Alors, le vote est maintenant ouvert.
The voting is complete. Mr. Secretary General, for the result of the vote.
106 for, none against, no abstentions.
So this motion is adopted. Mr. Deputy of Matane-Matapédia.
Madam President, we would like to send the result of this motion to the Canadian Prime Minister and Buckingham Palace.
It is being redone, Mr. Deputy. So we will continue.
all right. What does that say to you? It looks like Quebec unilaterally pulled out of Canada by disavowing the Canadian head of state. Now, I said some very unkind things about King Charles III after his speech from the throne. I said it was absolutely appalling that he pretended the House of Commons sits on land never ceded by two First Nations units or nations, whatever you want to call it. I said that is not only pathetic, it's appalling, and it's not true. That land is not owned by anybody but the government of Canada. So that's, and all this constant need to recognize lands as belonging and never ceded by First Nations units. I don't know if we can still say tribe. I don't want to be offensive, but Indigenous peoples then. If we pretend that Indigenous people still own all of Canada, we are either stupid or we're deluded, or both. Anyway, digital services tax. I talked a lot about it yesterday. Well, guess what? My good friend Rupa Subramanya pointed out that Pierre Poilievre supported the digital services tax. I'm seeing a lot of material on social media saying, my God, if only Pierre Poilievre was prime minister, we would have the digital services tax scrapped. I'm not sure we would, because let's listen to what Pierre Poilievre actually had to say about the digital services tax.
Cette annonce hier, oui, il a parlé de la loi 96, mais aussi parlé des géants numériques GAFAM. Et en juin va commencer l'imposition de ces géants du numérique. 3 a été obtenu de haute lutte. Alors, si vous devenez premier ministre, allez-vous maintenir l'imposition sur les géants numériques, le GAFAM?
Oui, je supporte cette imposition. Le principe est juste. L'idée, Mme Dussault, c'est que ces entreprises gagnent de revenus ici au Canada. Donc, le principe, c'est qu'ils devraient contribuer là où ils gagnent le revenu. Donc, je pense que dans cette question, on devrait garder ça en place. Mais en même temps, il faut couper d'autres taxes et impôts pour ramener l'investissement au Canada pour les petites entreprises, pour des fermiers. Et enlever le TPS sur les nouvelles maisons pour les rendre plus abordables, c'est la réduction d'impôts que je veux proposer, mais pas une réduction d'impôts pour les géants numériques qui autrement paieraient rien ici au Canada.
Seems clear to me that Pierre Poilievre was 100% behind the digital services tax. Now, is he today? Is his position the same today, given the fact that Donald Trump has said trade talks are over unless Canada scraps the digital services tax? Because it comes into effect tomorrow, Monday. $2 billion in back taxes from digital streaming companies. Because it's retroactive. So it is basically extortion. It's more government extortion, just like other censorship bills the Trudeau government introduced and passed to extort money. That's all this is about. So you ask yourself, why isn't Pierre Poilievre saying anything about this? I don't see anything on his X account. I don't see another video, fireside chat talking about the digital services tax. Nothing. It's incumbent upon Pierre Poilievre to say something about this digital services tax or digital sales tax, or the DST as it's being labeled. He needs to say the Conservative Party of Canada would scrap this tax, and we need to recall Parliament right now in order to scrap this tax. And Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, needs to recognize the need to scrap this tax immediately because it's going to have catastrophic effects. And there's absolutely no justification for having it. And Pierre Poilievre knows that. Mark Carney knows that. Mark Carney is using this as another hinge moment, as he likes to call them. He likes to create a crisis so that he can justify the use of extraordinary powers. And that's what Mark Carney is up to here. I see Jason is standing on board here. I'm just going to show you a quick interview from yesterday, a sneak peek of what's coming up on his show, and then we'll have Jason on.
She's trying to play both sides of the street, and she has to at this point. But I think there will come a time where she's going to have to come down hard on one side or the other, and that's going to be disappointing to one side or the other. But I sympathize with that choice because it's not an easy one. And I think she is a federalist right now because that's how she was elected. And if she comes out of the closet tomorrow and says, I've really been a separatist all these years, it's not going to look real to begin with. And it would be totally contravene the trust Albertans have in her. She ran as a federalist. And I don't think she can do this metamorphosis overnight and say, okay, I'm embracing separatism because it's the key to my political future. I think she could inevitably or ultimately do that. But in the meantime,
just get rid of it. Stop.
This is a very delicate and fragile process,
Anyway, the volume is probably a little low on that one. My apologies. We're going to have to pick up the volume, but that's not going to be the problem when Jason puts this all together. And so it's my great pleasure at this time to welcome Jason Levine onto the show. Finally, Jason, we should have been doing this a long time ago. In fact, I was just reminded, put your Alberta Proud hat on. This is part of our new merch. This is part of our new merchandise. So this is about as far as we can go in terms of the whole debate in Alberta. But I think you can be proud of Alberta, whether you're on the side of independence or on the side of Alberta staying in Canada. And certainly the Premier, Daniel Smith, is Alberta proud. So Jason, welcome to the show. Before I ask you what you've been up to for the past month or so traveling across Canada, I just talked about the digital services tax, which is coming into effect tomorrow, and the fact that Conservative leader, then official opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, supported the digital services tax unequivocally in an interview in Quebec. It's interesting because Justin Trudeau used to say some of his most controversial things in Quebec interviews that the English media never picked up on. This one was a Quebec interview, but he clearly articulates his support for the digital services tax. Not only does he say it's appropriate, he says it's just. And this is something we can. But my question to you is, why isn't Pierre Poilievre doing anything this weekend, saying anything this weekend, putting up fireside chat videos, going on X, and articulating his position, given the fact that things have changed since April? Now Donald Trump is saying this is a huge sticking point. If you don't scrap this DST, trade talks are over. So I think it's incumbent upon Pierre Poilievre to either say we still support it, or no, given the new circumstances, we can't support it, and we need to recall Parliament, even if it's virtual. Because people say, well, you can't recall the MPs at the summer break. Yeah, you can. All they have to do is sit in their office and they can virtually vote. But where is Pierre Poilievre, and should he be talking right now about this digital services tax? Because I think this is the most catastrophic issue facing the nation this weekend.
Absolutely agree with you, and I'm very surprised that he's not coming out with a stronger opposition to this. But maybe politically, going to align with a tax is better than align with what Trump has to say. And it might be one of these situations where whatever Trump says, if he says zig, they're going to zag. And we're seeing a lot of alignment when it comes to the two major parties here in Canada, which will keep stoking everybody's concerns that we have a uniparty actually running this country, and they don't really fight against each other. They spend more time fighting against other oppositions like the third parties out there. And it is unfortunate to see that yet another tax is coming to Canadians. We have a long list of them, but I can actually kind of maybe thank Pierre a bit, because this might be yet one more talking point at the right time for Alberta when it comes to why we should go ahead and look at other options than staying within Canada. Because taxes just like this are being put into place without opposition, being put in place with the leadership, without debate, without Parliament. And these are just great selling features if you're out in Alberta looking to have independence and take a stand against Ottawa, because this is exactly what's happening. With Pierre running in Alberta, you would expect him to actually think about what the constituents in the riding he's running in would want. And the last thing they would want is yet another tax from Ottawa that's not debated, it's not fair, and it shouldn't be happening. So I agree with you, David. The lack of opposition from the opposition, we're presuming he will become the opposition leader after he wins his seat, is very disheartening. A fireside chat, some sort of video. There's a lot of options for him to get out there to get that message in French, in English, and it's unfortunate that we're seeing that. I assure you, there's other people like Maxime Bernier who heavily opposes this and want to make sure Canada hears that. But as you said, the Liberals are passing it, and it's with the support of Conservatives, and that's heartbreaking. But if you're looking for independence for Alberta, this is going to be another reason why we should be doing exactly that.
Well, no question. This is another nail in the coffin of federalism. But we talk about Pierre Poilievre running in this by-election in Alberta. I've said repeatedly, this won't be a cakewalk for him. I think he'll win because, as you pointed out to me yesterday, the current incumbent had 80% of the vote in the last election. So it's a pretty safe seat, probably the safest seat in Canada for a Conservative. But is Pierre Poilievre taking a lot for granted here, that he can just waltz through this by-election and just not only win by his name, but not even have to address the I know incredible separatist independent sentiment in that writing? Does he think he can just walk through this without addressing these concerns, or just ignoring them and dismissing them?
Well, I think he's made a couple mistakes. I think he should have looked for another seat in Ontario, which would have been more aligned with his messaging, because there was no separation movement out there. When the rumor first came out, there was a riding in Edmonton, actually, where the incumbent there was offering up to resign for Pierre But if you looked at the numbers, that was just switched over to Conservative from NDP. And if NDP Liberal teamed up, they would have been able to win the seat back. So it looks like Pierre kind of did some math there and thought that that was a high-risk opportunity for him. And he did find one of the highest, if not the highest, turnout for Conservatives in Alberta. I'm curious why he's choosing Alberta, though. I think Ontario would have been a better fit for him. He spent the last 20 years representing a riding in Ontario, and he's more aligned with what people out east is looking for. So for him to come to Alberta and stake his flag here, I find that peculiar. But where I think he's going with this is he's going to be fighting against any separation movement out there. I think he's trying to come there and calm the waters when it comes to that particular conversation. If you could have the leader of the opposition in a riding in Alberta, I think maybe they think that's going to remove some of the support. But I think he's going to wake up to a rude awakening. He's not going to get anywhere near 80% support in this by-election. It's definitely going to drop. The question is by how much. There's going to be lots of opposition. There's going to be a lot of independent candidates running against him in this one as well. And I do believe that we might see the return of Cameron Davies, who just ran a by-election on a provincial level and took 18% support from the UCP. So we may see something very similar out there for Pierre when he runs. I do expect him to win. I don't think it's going to flip to any other party, but we're going to see that support drop from 80, maybe down to 60 or even 50. And if that is the case, that's going to be a little referendum on the state of what Alberta says when it comes to the Conservative Party being representation and whether or not they want to strongly support the opposition here in Canada, because they're pretty fed up in Alberta. We've now had 4 terms of this, and we don't see the representation changing. And especially with things like this digital sales tax, where there is no opposition on it, that's just another nail in the coffin when it comes to the Conservative Party in Canada in Alberta, in my opinion.
Well, if he squeaks through on this, I think his leadership's in danger. I think there's probably going to be the knives will be out. I'll put it that way, because I don't think he's demonstrated much of a fight since the Liberals won the last election. It's been, from what I've been observing, they were co-opted on Bill C-5. Ridiculous claims from some people saying, "Oh, the Conservatives gutted it," and I've absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. The bill was basically restored in the Senate to its original format. This is a dangerous bill for corporate control of this country. Mark Carney's personal control of this country, of projects going through. Pierre Poilievre said virtually nothing in opposition to this bill. C2, again, this is the massive surveillance bill, the RCMP opening mail, digital currency, banning more than $10,000 in cash sales. Nothing said by Pierre Poilievre on this. There was a couple of Conservative MPs who seemed brave enough to question it, but Pierre Poilievre has been avoiding any controversy, and this I don't think is going to help him in this by-election. You ask why he didn't run in Ontario. Well, I guess I'll say it. Scott Reid, Cheryl Gallant, these are long-serving Conservative MPs from the Ottawa Valley, which is extremely small C conservative, and has supported Conservative candidates faithfully throughout the years. I guess Scott and Cheryl, whom I both know, just weren't ready to retire yet, and that's what it comes down to. So, but I think it's going to be a very difficult campaign. Not that I think, as you said, that he's going to lose, but I think every doorstep he goes to, people are going to say, "Go ahead, make my day. Tell me why I should stay a Federalist. Tell me why I shouldn't support independence, Pierre. Tell me that." And I think it's going to be a heck of a difficult sojourn for Pierre Poilievre. But I want to ask you, like, I sat down with you yesterday here in Ottawa with Lisa Robinson, the counselor from Pickering, who is fighting so hard for free speech. But you've been doing these interviews across Canada now for how long? And how many people have you talked to? And can you just mention a few of the names? And are you going to piece this all together in a documentary, or are you releasing it in separate portions?
Well, I love those questions. We've been planning this since before the election, because I definitely want to have some more conversations on my show. The plan is 50 separate interviews. So there'll be 50 episodes that are released. might be 3 or 2 a week. As we start to release them, you'll see these coming out. Currently, I've interviewed 4 people. That would be Ken Drysdale, which I'm going to go re-record because we had some camera issues. Yourself, Lisa Robertson, and Randy Hilliard. Now I'm lined up to interview, 46 more people. That will include Stockwell Day, Cam Davies from the Republican Party, Theo Fleury, Art Hanger, a good friend of yours and quite the voice on Alberta, Danielle Smith herself, and some members of Danielle Smith's panel from the Alberta Next panel. So if you pay attention to the series over the next few months, it's going to be conversations across Canada, very different opinions, very different viewpoints and perspectives, and then some predictions on these outcomes that might happen, whether it's a no, whether it's a yes, whether it's stronger sovereignty in Canada, independence from Canada, and possibly even the issue of statehood with the US. So if you pay attention for the next little bit, I'll be releasing these on all my platforms. There'll be 30-minute episodes because we do want to kind of condense the conversation and get it to you, but there'll be 50 of them. My next stop is Montreal. Maxime Bernier, Matt Ehret will be there as well. And we're looking to get a couple more people from Quebec from the separation movement of the 90s. And believe it or not, you may not understand some people out in Alberta, but Quebec is pushing to be the 51st state. So there might be a race there. So we're looking to have those conversations and bring it back to Alberta so we can have a good view and understanding about what other people think across Canada. And you'll be surprised. There's a lot of support across Canada for Alberta to go ahead and take this next step. I'm looking forward to Bruce Pardy. He'll be joining me in the Toronto area in a couple of weeks. Lawrence Solomon as well. So we're going to have these conversations about some of the next steps for Alberta, what would a constitution look like, and maybe what other provinces should be considering the same type of path forward.
You mentioned Quebec perhaps opting to be the 51st state. I reported earlier on the show here about a vote that occurred in the National Assembly, I hate to use that word, of the Quebec legislature, where they unanimously supported a motion to disavow King Charles III as Canada's head of state. Now, this was reported, and I missed it entirely because I was looking at all of the references this morning. Globe and Mail covered it, CTV News covered it, Montreal Gazette covered it, The Economist covered it. But there was no subsequent discussion in terms of columnists, op-eds. It wasn't a topic on CTV's question period or power play. Never came up again. But to me, this is potentially absolutely explosive because Quebec, I think this is like de facto separatism. They have voted to disavow the head of state. They can't do that. I mean, you can say we don't like the monarchy. You can say we don't identify with the monarchy. Quebecers don't think it's relevant. A lot of Canadians have that same opinion. However, you cannot deny that King Charles is constitutionally the Canadian head of state with his representative as the Governor General. And if you pretend that that's not the case, I don't know how you can say you're still part of Canada. And I spoke with our mutual friend yesterday, Jeff Rath, a constitutional lawyer, and he said, what impact does this have on all of those MPs from Quebec who are in the Liberal caucus? Does that not nullify their representational powers? Because their province says it's not really a part of Canada anymore. I just want your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not surprised Quebec came out strong in that because with their French background coming from France, they never did recognize the English monarchy as part of their leadership. They've always been pushing against that. In Canada, the last poll I saw was 23% support for the monarch, which means overwhelming majority definitely does want to go ahead and have a different head of state, or elected one, somebody that we can remove if necessary through recall or an election. And of all the current Commonwealth countries, Canada has the lowest support for a monarchy, and that includes Jamaica, who's currently moving to a constitutional republic and removing the constitutional monarchy from their constitution. And this is a peaceful process. It can go through the parliament and get it done through just paperwork and votes and representation. And this is definitely a desire out in Alberta. It does seem that Ontario doesn't push as hard as the rest of the other provinces. Maybe there's a legacy there that I think we spoke about in our interview with Randy Hilliard. But at the end of the day, I don't think Canada would support it. But there's a desire to kind of focus on other issues if you talk to people. And that's where I don't agree. I think The constitutional monarchy is part of our problem. The Westminster system is part of our problem. It doesn't give fair representation. It doesn't give democracy tools like recall, at least fair democracy tools. And you get things like appointed leaders of your country. So our head of state is King Charles, but our head of government is appointed by the head of state. We don't vote for Carney. We vote for the representation of the party, and then the party picks that leadership, as we saw when Carney was first the prime minister without a single vote out of Canada. And those are the kind of things you get in the Westminster system when you don't actually control who the head of state is. The US, of course, they do the voting on their side for the head of state and head of government, and they even have secession in place. So if there's something happens to the leader, there's a vice president. This is the kind of stuff that a lot of people in Alberta would like to see happen. And of course, if Alberta does take the step to remove themselves from Canada, that would also include the monarchy as well. There'll be no desire, there'll be nobody pushing to go ahead and join officially with a constitutional monarchy again. So the divorce that Alberta's looking for, it's from Canada and the monarchy. And I'm actually kind of proud that Quebec is standing up strong on this one. And I would like to see a few more provinces do that, like Newfoundland, Labrador might be a good one. New Brunswick might be a good one as well. There's a lot of French there that would actually say, no, he's not our king. And this has been a movement ever since Carney came and entered the stage. You will see a lot of people saying, not my king. This is because they're kind of fed up with this idea. So, you know, I'm glad that Quebec is doing that. This might be a step towards some bigger change. If Quebec is saying we don't want a king, if Alberta is saying we don't want to be part of Canada, this might force Ottawa into a constitutional convention where provinces sit down and try to renegotiate in order to keep Canada together. And I really think one of the major issues that would be on the table, and if it can't be resolved, that would be the end of that, would be whether or not we stay a constitutional monarchy. I think it's time for us to grow up as a country, be a state on our own. When I say state, I mean Canada as a whole, and go ahead and drop the King Charles. Ever since Elizabeth's death, you can see that the support here in Canada has dropped tremendously. There was a lot of people that related to Queen Elizabeth, grew up with her, respected her, but on her passing, that's kind of where a lot of minds changed. So I think it's time. I think it's time to have that conversation as well. And Alberta leaving might also start igniting that conversation.
Well, I would agree that support for the monarchy is plummeting under King Charles III, and I did not appreciate Mark Carney bringing him over for the speech from the throne. I did not appreciate the king referring to the lands that the House of Commons sits on as belonging to First Nations. They don't. That's complete delusion. But Quebec always wants its cake and eat it too. But I think this brings some ambiguity into Quebec's relationship with Canada right now, and nobody's asking that question. I would like to see Alberta say, fine, you don't recognize the head of state, and you can say we don't like the head of state, you can say we don't like this current constitutional format, but you have to change it first. You can't just deny it exists. I would like Alberta to say, okay, you think you're not part of Canada? We're cutting off equalization payments. I would love to see that. Because Quebec always thinks it can stand up and say whatever it wants in rhetorical flourishes, but it doesn't have to reap the consequences of those words. And that's why I've been fed up with Quebec for years, because they suck the rest of the country dry. They basically they get everything they want in Canada, but continue to use the threat of separation to get more. And I would agree with you in terms, and I'm hearing this from so many people, that they don't think the Westminster system of government is adding any value anymore to our democratic way of life, and whatever democratic way of life we have left in this country. So I think we're inevitably going to move on in a new direction. It's just a question for me whether or not that means with Alberta in the country or Alberta not part of the country. What are what's your prediction for the vote for independence? Because, I mean, Daniel Smith has promised one next year, but the Alberta Prosperity Project is looking to have a referendum question included in this fall's municipal elections. So if that's possible, if that comes to pass, do you think there would be adequate support, meaning under the Clarity Act and I think you said yesterday the Clarity Act is not very clear at times, but if there's 50% plus one support for independence in a fall referendum, do you think that is possible? Do you think the timing is right for that in the fall, or should the forces of independence wait until 2026 and go with Danielle Smith's program?
Yeah, so Jeff Rath is the one that's really pushing hard to get it in the fall. I don't think the time is right in the fall, and I don't think that the changes to Bill 54 will allow that. There will be 120 days from the time that the petition question is, well, the petition itself is launched for signatures. You need to get 177,000 signatures, and you got 120 days to do that, so that's 4 months. And then the government of Alberta, Elections Alberta, will take another 120 days to go ahead and verify those signatures. So that's a total of 8 months, assuming that it started even just today. So that'll take us past that particular election. And just to clarify one thing, Danielle Smith is not bringing this referendum forward in the spring. She is doing an Alberta Next panel to bring up other questions. And I think the hot one for her is the Alberta pension plan and possibly even the Alberta police force. Those types of questions. She's been very clear that she's not bringing the sovereignty question up, whether or not we leave Canada. She's leaving that to the people. And Alberta Prosperity Project absolutely has taken a lead on that. They have over 250,000 people that have signed up and said their intent is to vote yes. And then the next step will be to reach out to those 250,000 people to get a signature to be part of the 177 valid thousand signatures to ensure that this goes forward. And that's also after the process happens, whether or not Alberta Elections Alberta accepts the question. The government plays a big role in whether or not this goes to the people in a referendum, including passing a motion to actually have the referendum. So I don't think we're going to see it sooner than spring of 2026. We will have the municipal elections. There may be some municipal questions on the table. Maybe in some different ridings, they may be able to get the question on the table, but that will not be a provincial-wide binding referendum. So I know that Jeffy, he's very ambitious, and he definitely wants to have it as soon as possible, and I like that desire, but I don't think the process will allow it to happen that quickly. Now, to the Clarity Act is very unclear, and that includes what is a majority. It needs to be a strong majority or a clear majority, I think the wording is. So I don't think even 50% plus one is going to be accepted, because you got to remember, under the Clarity Act, it's the House of Commons that decides whether or not there's a clear majority and it's a clear question. These are two hurdles that have yet to be tested under the Clarity Act. And I do think that this is a bit of a roadblock, because there's going to be zero support in this House of Commons, because every single MP from Alberta, basically a bunch of conservatives, will be losing their jobs if Alberta separates, because we'll have no need to have MPs. We'll be doing everything in the new nation of Alberta. And we've already seen resistance from not just Pierre Poilievre, but in my riding, Dane Lloyd, who I ran against in the last election. He actually proactively shut down conversation in Spruce Grove when there was an event booked where I was a speaker at it, amongst other speakers. And Dane Lloyd and the local MLA and the local city councillors threatened the venue. It was the Pioneer Museum. To remove funding, to pull their funding from their books if they went ahead and allowed this democratically allowable conversation to happen. So we already have resistance from the Conservative Party in Alberta actively resisting it. So I don't see any support in the House itself. There's going to be very little people like, I wish I won my seat, because I would definitely debate this question strongly. Because there's no clear question on whether or not it has to be 50% plus one, 60%, 70%. What is the number? That's yet to be determined and debated. And whether or not the question is clear enough. There's a lot of people who kind of feel like this question that was proposed by the Alberta Prosperity Project might be a two-part question. And will they be using that in the House of Commons to say it wasn't a clear question? So I think we have some hurdles when we go through the Clarity Act. But I do want to let Alberta know that's not the only path forward. It's not the only peaceful path forward, too. Declaration of independence like Kosovo did is a path forward, and Canada was one of the countries that recognized their independence after they declared independence. And we can do that right after the election of 50 plus one, because at that point there is a majority, and if Alberta can't do it with the consent of Canada through the Clarity Act, then we also have the option to declare it on our own and have support from another nation like the US to go ahead and recognize that independence. Jeffrey has done some great work around that. So the conversations have already started about recognizing the independence of Alberta, and he has declared, and he has shared this in the public, that there is US support out of the State Department to recognize Alberta's independence if we get to the point of a referendum yes result. So there's a few paths forward here. I don't think it's going to be easy to get consent from Canada unless it's a very clear number like 70% plus, where it's going to be very difficult and maybe even embarrassing for the House of Commons to go ahead and say that that wasn't clear enough. But if it comes back at 50% plus one, I can see them really fighting against it, and there'll be nobody in that House of Commons. All 343 will be looking to keep Canada together because, as we've mentioned before, Alberta is an economic powerhouse of Canada, does supply a lot of funds across Canada, especially Quebec. And I don't think they're going to want to see that happen and change anytime soon. So there'll be a challenge there. But there is peaceful means to move forward. There's no reason to look at like 1776 as a mechanism. We can look at Jamaica, we can look at Kosovo, and there's other countries around the world that did it through referendums and elections. So these are the paths Alberta has. I don't think we're going to get the referendum in fall. It's going to be in spring 2026. And hopefully the referendums questions that Danielle Smith is bringing up doesn't complicate things too much, so that gives yet another reason for the House of Commons to deny these results. So we'll see. We'll see. We're all going to be fighting for the path forward through the House of Commons. We would like to see it with consent. We'd like to see it through negotiation with good faith talks and address all the issues. But I'm not sure we're going to reach a day where we have that vote and it's agreed upon by the rest of Canada that Alberta can just pack up its resources, its economic power, and go ahead and leave. I think it's going to be a contested divorce would be a way to look at this one.
I think most Canadians assume, or at least believe, that the Clarity Act is 50% plus one, and that's simply going to be enough. But you're saying that this could be sabotaged by the House of Commons, and because if it's not 50 plus one, what is the number? I mean that's why they passed the Clarity Act, because is it 60%? Is it 65? That gets ridiculous. But I don't think there's going to be pushback to the point of military intervention in this country. It's just simply not going to happen, and there's no appetite for that. But
No.
as you say, there are other alternatives. If this doesn't work in terms of a simple majority, that there, as you say, declaration of independence would be another option. I think you've got some very smart people working on this file right now in Alberta, and I think they're probably considering all of these options. But I'll ask you a final question, Jason. A question you asked me yesterday. And you reminded me that my old friend Preston Manning said that this could be the last election in Canada as it's currently constituted if Mark Carney wins this thing. And he did. He won this thing. I think he's fast tracking us to an authoritarian state right now. And the amazing thing is, just like other dictators in other countries at other times, the opposition is co-opted and they're helping him move this country in an authoritarian direction. Wittingly or not, they are helping this man seize power in a backroom government. Do you think we are going to see another election in Canada as it's currently constituted?
That's an excellent question, and the process to go ahead and separate is going to possibly be lengthy if we're trying to do it with consent, because the House of Commons with the Clarity Act, well, first the Supreme Court, they could have put a number in. They could have said 50% plus one, but they didn't. And I can see some of the arguments being, well, you have 2.5 million people that can vote, but only 2 million showed up. That leaves 500,000 unrepresented. When you check those numbers, it's below the majority. Or I can see them doing a lot of arguments like that. Who was denied access to voting? Who was allowed access? Was it only people that voted in the last provincial election that has access, or was it everybody in Alberta? I can see how they're setting the stage for a lot of debate. But unfortunately, I think for Alberta and the representation, there's going to be very little support for debating for the separation if it comes back as a yes. there's going to be a lot of opposition, and you're going to see all parties align on this one. Even May with the Green Party in the Bloc, everybody's going to align on this one because how much money goes from west to east. I don't think they're going to find a way to agree that Alberta should go ahead and do that. And then also the question itself. The Supreme Court could have laid out a question that kind of left a blank spot for the name of the province, but laid out a question that would have been acceptable. They didn't do that either. They left it up to the House of Commons to debate that process and that question. So I think these are two hurdles that are going to be kind of difficult to get over unless it's clear across the board and with a massive majority of like 70% plus. If it's between 60 and 70, I think it's definitely going to be debatable, but could go in the favor of Alberta. If it's 50 to 60, I think it's going to be debatable, but not go in the favor of Alberta with the House of Commons support. Now, whether or not the Supreme Court gets involved after that, that itself is a question. We're not sure if that would happen, or does it go to an international court, or does Alberta just do independence through a declaration? These paths are not completely clear at this stage. But I do think that Alberta is resolved enough to go ahead and bring the question forward. We do have groups like Alberta Prosperity Project, who's been working on this question for quite some time. Some good people behind that, working really hard on the legal side. And I understand there's even draft constitutions and Bill of Rights in place already, so that as this moves forward, these questions can be kind of clarified and presented to Alberta. And exactly how a transitional government would work, that's really going to be up to Danielle Smith and her current government if we get to that point, because it would be her government that would be the transitional government as we move to whatever's next, whether it's a constitutional republic or a territory of the US or whatever it turns out to be. There's going to be a lot more questions that need to be answered. But I do see that the resolve is high. People like Preston Manning coming out saying this is the highest he's ever seen the support for separation. When I go around the streets talking to people, I find very few people who actually want to keep everything exactly the same way as it is. Everybody wants change in Alberta. And Danielle Smith might be the one figure here where if she decides, or she knows that she has the support of it, that if she comes forward and she declares her position as a yes, then I think that that's what could actually tip the scale in favor of a separation for Alberta. But at this stage, I think what Danielle's doing is she's doing a good job on trying to make sure that the people have their say, and she's opening a couple doors to make sure that the referendum itself can happen by removing some of the barriers, like 600,000 signature requirement down to 177,000. So I do see what she's doing as a good idea. Open the doors to the people, have them come forward with the question and do the vote. But I think at some point, if Danielle Smith is fed up with Ottawa and Carney, because she's really put in a lot of faith in the fact that they can maybe get some negotiation and concessions. But I see that faith is starting to waver lately. I see that she's starting to see Mark Carney for who he is, what a lot of us understood him to be, and that is somebody that's going to align the resources and the people of Canada with Europe and global bankers and banking debt. So I think that that's what Carney is here for. He's got a lot of friends in that market. He definitely knows it well. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada, the governor of the Bank of England, and he's already moving Canada far closer to Europe than the US or any other partners that we've traditionally had. So I think Danielle is starting to see Mark Carney for who he is. He may have come off of that little election with hinting at some concessions with pipelines and removing trade barriers. But now she's starting to see that when push comes to shove, he's not going to be working with her. So I think over the next 4 months or so, we're going to see either a shift in the conversation out of Ottawa that aligns closer with what Alberta's demanding, because we're no longer asking, we're demanding now. And we may see a shift in Danielle Smith in her conversation. For example, the Alberta police force she's not calling it the Alberta Provincial Police. She's calling it the Alberta Police Force, which may be a little tip of her hat that she doesn't want to name change later. It will work no matter what we end up doing. But I do see Danielle Smith as pretty key to this conversation, and whether or not it's going to be successful. She's going to have to play a big role.
No doubt. And I wasn't suggesting earlier that she's actively pushing for a referendum. She's just making that process possible. And
yeah,
she's lowering the bar. She is leaving it to the people. So, but I do think it's as Eisenhower's Secretary of State John Foster Dulles used to say, she is possibly headed towards an agonizing reappraisal of a lot of her positions. And I don't envy that. I think she's a brilliant leader. She's a fair woman. She's an honest politician, if there could be such a thing. And I think she's going to have some difficult choices ahead, but I think she'll contemplate them very carefully. So, Jason Levine, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm always available to appear with you anywhere, anytime. And we just love the work you're doing for the province and for the country, keeping politicians honest. And I think, like myself, you're in nobody's pocket, and that's always important. So thank you for joining me today, and Jason, and let's always stay in touch.
Thanks for your time, David. It was great to meet you in person finally, and I look forward to releasing your episode in the coming weeks. You have yourself a great day, and say hi to your lovely wife for me.
Will do, and thank you yesterday for a marvelous time.
My pleasure. Thank you, and God bless.
That was Jason Levine, and absolutely wonderful interview yesterday. And we'll be back in a moment with some concluding remarks. Thanks for joining me today, folks. We got some great guests coming up for the week, including a journalist who's been doing some incredible work with the Mexican cartels. We've got a Ontario school board member who has been suspended for daring to question these land acknowledgements at the beginning of school board meetings, and possibly more. But thank you for joining. I'm back again tomorrow, 10 o'clock. This has been David Krayden, broadcasting to you live from Ottawa. Godspeed, God bless, and we'll see you soon.